Well, my name is Frank Perry, and it's a pleasure to have you all here this morning for this tour. A while back, Amy Dunning of the Museum of Art and History here in Santa Cruz asked me to lead this tour. And I would like to introduce a couple of my co-authors who are also here this morning.
Alberta Orlando.
And Bob Pywarczyk here. He's going to be holding up photos from time to time. So, what we're going to do is we're going to walk to several different spots around here and look at the different historic features. And at each spot, I'll say a few words. And then before we leave, if you have some questions, we can field some questions before we move on to the next location. Our discussion this morning, our trip, really all comes down to one thing, and that's this little rock here. This is a piece of what some people call limestone. Other people call it marble. In the book, we decided to call it lime rock. But this is chemically, it's calcium carbonate. It's the same material that seashells and corals are made out of. And in fact, this was probably originally formed from seashells that were deposited on the floor of an ancient sea millions of years ago.
Are limestone and marble the same thing?
That's in the book. There's about 2 or 3 pages explaining about the terms limestone and marble, and it kind of depends on who you're talking to. Geologists would call this marble. Technically it's marble. It is a metamorphic rock, but people in the stone industry tend to talk about this kind of rock according to how it's used. And since this rock isn't, cut and polished and used as dimensional stone, instead it's, today it's ground up and made into cement up in Davenport. They call it limestone, but technically it's marble. So we decided to avoid the whole issue and call it lime rock in the book. So anyway, this is very important. This is what they used to make lime. If it were not for this rock, which is, we'll see some outcrops around here. If it was not for this rock, we would not be here today, and in fact the entire university would not be here. So I'll pass this little rock around. This is actually Bob's rock, so be sure and get it back to him. If you heat this in a fire, some rather interesting things happen. The rock keeps its shape, but it shrinks slightly in size. It shrinks to about 80% of its original size. Also, the rock loses almost half its weight. And what's happening is that the calcium carbonate is converting to calcium oxide, which is lime. And in the process, CO2 gas is released. Well, lime is an amazing material. You can do all kinds of things with lime. In the late 1800s and very early 1900s, most of the lime that was made in this area was used for construction. It was mixed with sand and water to make a mortar for building brick buildings and other kinds of masonry structures like foundations and walls and fireplaces, chimneys. It can also be mixed with sand and water to make plaster. Some of you may live in older homes that have walls done in lath and plaster. Well, that's lime plaster that was used. It also was used to make a whitewash, which is a very dilute solution of the lime in water, which is why I'm standing right here, because if you look behind me on the old horse barn here, you can see some of the remnants of the whitewash coating on the old boards. This was a use in place of paint. They painted the whitewash on the boards to protect them. And most, not all, but most of the historic buildings here at the entrance to the UCSC campus were originally whitewashed, but most of them the whitewash has worn off. Well, today lime isn't used so much in construction, but it's still a very, very important material. In fact, I would venture that probably every one of us here this morning has had at least 50 encounters with lime, and we didn't even know it. It's used to treat water. It's used in the manufacturing of steel. It's used in the manufacturing of a lot of plastics. It's on the backing of carpeting that's probably in your car. It's used in the chemical industry, pharmaceutical industry, all kinds of different things. So it's all over the place, but it's kind of hidden away where we don't notice it so much. Well, this property of taking this rock, this kind of rock, and heating it in a kiln or fire and turning it into lime has been known for many thousands of years. The ancient Romans and also the ancient Maya in Central America, both of those civilizations used lime on a grand scale in construction. And lime plaster has been found by archaeologists in Turkey dating back 7,000 years. Here in California, lime was not manufactured and used in construction until the Spanish first arrived in the 1700s. One of the interesting things I found out not too long ago is that actually it was watching Jeopardy on TV, so I hope it's accurate. But from their question and answer, or answer and question, however it works, it was clear that lime, the word lime came along first, and that limestone got its name because that was stone that you could make lime out of. So the emphasis was on the lime, not on the stone. Lime was not made on a large scale in California until the gold rush. Of course, that's when California really changed in many, many ways, and thousands of people started populating the state, and cities and towns started to grow up, and lime was needed for building brick buildings and other uses. This very spot where we are today, here at the entrance to the UC Santa Cruz campus at the end of Bay Street, was the most important area for lime production in all of California back in the 1850s and 1860s. In 1854, for example, the firm of Davis and Jordan, which was situated here then, manufactured 35,000 barrels of lime and shipped all those barrels to San Francisco. There were 50,000 barrels altogether made in Santa Cruz County that year. So that's about 70% of this county's lime was made by this one company, and Santa Cruz County at that time made most of the lime in California. So this was really, this site here is of statewide significance. Davis and Jordan came here in about 1853, as near as we could tell. But they were not the first people to, first Americans to make lime here. There was a fellow by the name of Francis Brady, who in 1849 had a kiln somewhere in Santa Cruz. We're not quite sure where. We know about him because somebody bought a bunch of lime from him, and he didn't deliver the lime, and so they sued him. So there's some court records that tell about him. And also, as Ross Gibson will tell you, Cedric Lynch, whose house is still located down on Westcliff Drive near the wharf, Cedric Lynch was here very early making lime in 1851 and 52. In fact, he may have been making lime in the same area here, but we don't know very much about his activities either. But in 1853, Isaac Elphinstone Davis and Albion Paris Jordan came here, and they apparently had the capital to go into business in a big way. And they started buying up large parcels of land, and they built several kilns. They commissioned their own special wagons for hauling the lime. They had their own wharf down at the end of Bay Street. They had their own ships. So it was a really big operation. The reason why they settled here, and this was the best spot in all of the Santa Cruz County, is because it's all shipping by then pretty much was by sea, and it's fairly close to the water, all downhill pretty much. There was redwood forests around for fuel, and it made it so it's just, and of course the good quality lime rock that they could fire in their kilns to make the lime. So that's why they settled here. Well, before we move to our next stop on the tour here, I wanted to just give you a little nutshell of kind of the company history of this property. In our book, we call these the Bay Street Kilns because that's a place that people can identify with today. We could have referred it to a certain, company's kilns, but that wouldn't have been a good idea because the company's name changed about 4 times. It started out as the firm of, well, maybe earlier as Lynch, but it started out for sure as the firm of Davis and Jordan. And then in 1865, Jordan sold out to Henry Cowell of San Francisco, and it became the firm of Davis and Cowell. In 1888, Davis died, and Cowell gained full ownership of the business the following year, and it became Henry Cowell and Company. Then in 1898, Cowell decided to incorporate and have his children give them some shares in the business, and so he formed the Henry Cowell Lime and Cement Company. And the Henry Cowell Lime and Cement Company continued making lime in these kilns, which we're going to see in a little while, up until about 1920. Then these kilns shut down, but there were some kilns that the company owned up at Rincon, which is on Highway 9 at the south edge of Henry Cowell Redwood State Park, and those kilns operated up until 1946. So that, in a nutshell, is the company history of the property. And before we get on to our next stop, are there any questions? Okay, the question is, where is the limestone quarried today? And the main place where it's quarried in this county is in up near Davenport. It's quarried, the same kind of rock which they used to make lime is now quarried up near Davenport for making Portland cement. Portland cement is kind of the modern day descendant of the lime industry. Portland cement came into common use in the early 1900s. It produces a much, much stronger mortar and other materials, stucco, than just the pure lime does. Portland cement is made by taking some of the lime rock and grinding it up and mixing it with alumina and iron and silicates and firing those all together in a kiln. And the result is a little thing called a clinker, little marble-sized things that come out of this rotating kiln. And that's the cement. That's what's then pulverized and put into bags like you buy at the store. Yeah, the question is, did the same people run the operation at Fall Creek? The Fall Creek lime kilns, that business there was originally started in the mid-1870s by the IXL Lime Company, which was a competitor of the firm of Davis and Cowell. In the 1890s, the IXL company folded, and in 1900, Henry Cowell bought the operation and reopened the kilns. And it's my understanding, though, that he kept the name, and so there was still some IXL lime being sold in the early 1900s, but it was really manufactured by Henry Cowell. Any other questions?
Pictures.
Pictures? Well, let me see. if there's a good picture to show at this particular stop. Well, I'll show this one. This is the one of taken in the 1920s of the Henry Cowell Lime and Cement Company works up at Rincon. And I think the rest of them I'll save for another stop. I'll keep you in suspense. These two buildings up on the hillside here are the last two surviving worker cabins from when this was the Davis and Cowell and later the Cowell Lime Works. A lot of the workers in the early days were from Ireland, ones back in the 1850s and 60s, and later on there were many from Switzerland and then Portugal and also Italy. Most of the Portuguese workers came from the Azores, which are islands out in the Atlantic off the coast of Portugal. In the early history of the university, earlier there were 5 cabins up here, and the joke was back in the 1960s was that those were the married student housing.
Someone asked if that building up there was a recent addition.
Oh, yeah, let me show that. Yeah, the building right behind the workers' cabins is one of the old barns. They had a lot of barns here. They didn't have trucks in the old days, so everything had to be hauled out of here by wagon, and they had to have animals to pull the wagons, so they had horses and oxen and mules and so forth. That barn up there, it shows up in this very early photograph in the early 1900s, around 1910 or 1920. And you can see it, these are the 2 cabins which have survived, and right behind it is the same barn.
This is an even earlier picture, and were you to compare, this barn is not the same building as the 1866, nor is this Cooperage the same as this Cooperage building. There's a step in the roof line here that doesn't exist here. Our conclusion is that these buildings relate to this single account, I think it was, that we found of the fire here on the ranch. So there might have been the fire that destroyed and then they rebuilt. But these are the kinds of mysteries of history, as Frank says.
That's interesting. The other picture too has one of the wagons, right? That's one of the wagons with the barrels of lime.
The large wagons we were talking about.
You want me to talk about that one here, or up? I was going to wait and talk about it up there, or is that too bright up there for you, Peter?
No, that's fine. I was thinking, what about wages? Since we're talking about the workers, do we know anything about what they were paid? I mean, I know there was a cookhouse, so was that part of the deal? Room and board?
Yeah, the workers were paid roughly $1 a day. But that did include room and board, because there was the cookhouse here where they had their meals, and of course they had the cabins where they could live. One of the really interesting things that, amazingly, Henry Cowell in the early days only paid the workers once a year. He paid them on New Year's Day. He brought the gold coins down from San Francisco, and at what's called the paymaster's house near the campus entrance, he paid the workers. And then he fired them all, and they could reapply for the job here if they wanted to. This building here is the Cooperage, and this is where the barrels were made to haul the lime. In those days they didn't have sacks, they didn't have pallets, they didn't have forklifts. So heavy things like the lime were put into barrels. The reason why they were stored in barrels is that barrels can be rolled around. You can just, push it around, kick it with your foot and spin it and turn it. And so when the lime arrived at the job site, it was easy to roll the barrel to just where they needed to then unload it. This building is really, I think of as a 2-story building. The upper part is where the barrels were assembled and the empty barrels stored. the parts weren't actually manufactured here. There was a, down near the entrance to the campus, there was a stave and head mill, which I guess probably was steam powered. I'm not sure about that. But that's where the parts were made, and then they assembled them up above here. And then when they were unloading the lime out of the kilns, which is in back of the cooperage here, the coopers up above would just throw the barrels down to the workers below, and the workers below would fill them up. If they had a pile up of filled barrels, they would store them underneath the cooperage, but usually they put them right onto the wagons and haul them down to a warehouse, which was at the head of the wharf at the foot of Bay Street. The floor here is just a, it's actually paved with bituminous sandstone, and so it's really hard. And the barrels, of course, were so heavy, weighing anywhere from 150 to 250 pounds, that it wouldn't have been practical to have a wooden floor. This way, by having it just right on the ground, they could back the wagon right underneath the cooperage and load it up. And you have that big picture we were looking at earlier, the 1866 one? Yes. Now, this is the earliest known photograph of this area, taken by Lawrence and Houseworth in San Francisco. This was taken in 1866. And this shows one of the big wagons, all being pulled by oxen and all loaded up with barrels. Here's a lot of extra barrels here. And the cooperage, this is actually an earlier cooperage. There was a fire in 1869, I think it was. And so 1869 is probably the date on this building. Another thing I wanted to mention, by coincidence, the very same day that our book, Lime Kiln Legacies, was published, was also the day that this historic district here at UCSC was approved for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. So that was quite a coincidence, and something that a lot of people have been hoping for a long time. And it is hoped by a lot of people in the history community, and also some of the people in the planning department on the campus, that this will eventually make it easier to get grant money and donations to restore some of the historic buildings here. Okay, well, let's move up here to about where that stone pillar is, and then we can look back and you can get a better look at the lime kilns. All right, well, you can all gather around here, and I'll talk a little bit about the star attraction on the tour, which of course are the lime kilns. I of course saved them for last, right? Interestingly, the kilns are made out of the lime rock, and some of the kilns in other parts of Santa Cruz County weren't even lined with anything special. But the lime rock, in order to turn into lime, the fire has to have air spaces all around it to get all around it and cook it and turn it into the lime. So it seemed to work just fine to make kilns out of the rock that you were also using to make the lime. And these kilns are lined with fire bricks, which is also helps protect them. All right, well, there are actually 4 kilns right here. There are 3, 1, 2, 3, and then there's this kind of odd-looking kiln over here, which I'll save till last. Each of the 3 kilns over here has 4 doorways in the bottom, and the inside measurements are about 15 feet high inside, and they're about 11 feet wide, and about, as I recall, about 30 or 31 feet long. Now, the steps are making lime. I'm going to tell you the steps here. There's just a few steps, and it's fairly simple. And it'll only take me a few minutes to tell you how to make lime. It took people who made the lime a few years to learn how to make it right. It's one of those crafts. In fact, some people even called it an art. And there are all kinds of things that could go wrong in making lime. And the reason why is because they were working with a natural material, the lime rock, which in some cases has various impurities in it. It varies in the size of the crystal grains and in the amount of moisture that's in the rock. And the rock had to be broken into just the right size, and different size rock had to be placed in different parts of the kiln when they were loading the kiln. So a lot of factors. The process started farther up the hill here, where there's a quarry. The rock was quarried and then loaded onto ore cars, which operated by gravity. There was like a little rail line, and the cars could just roll down here to the kilns. In fact, at most of the lime kilns around Santa Cruz County, the quarry was always uphill from the kilns. Very seldom was it downhill. And so a man would ride the cars down to operate the brakes so that they would actually stop when they got to the end of the line here. Bob, do you have that picture, the big picture again? I want to show that one more time. But this picture, if you look very, very closely, way over here, right there, is one of the cars sitting on the track. It's rather low. It's a low car. Some of you might want to take a little bit closer look at that earlier. And let's see, let me take these little pictures. So here's a picture of them, quarrying up in the quarry. This was in later years when they were using some carts pulled by horses at the upper quarry. And here's a picture taken right here. In fact, that building up there, which is the Blacksmith Shop, is this building right here. In this particular case, see, they kept changing things. They're trying to make it complicated for us historians. See, here they're not using the ore cars. They're using oxen to pull the rock, haul the rock down. So once the rock got down here, they loaded the kilns from the top, and they had to load them in a very special way. They had a person called an archer, whose job was to create open areas, arches, behind each doorway. So they didn't actually put the rock right behind each doorway. They left an open area, and they had the rock stacked between the doorways. And then as it got up high, they then bring the rock together to create an arch. And that open area behind each doorway was the fire chamber, and that's where they inserted the fuel. They used redwood timbers, 8-foot-long redwood timbers for fuel, and they used a lot of them. These kilns here produced about 1,200 barrels of lime for one burn, and that took about 140 cords of wood. So you can imagine how much it would cost these days to fire up one of these kilns. It would be, especially redwood, it'd be kind of expensive. So let's see here. I have this one here shows the cordwood being brought down the path, down the road. And all of the early pictures around here, like that big one, all show huge stacks of cordwood. Davis and Jordan, when they bought land here, they bought thousands of acres. They bought the entire Rincon Rancho back in 1859, and they weren't buying it because there was more lime rock there. Oh, that was some part of it, but mostly they were buying forests for fuel. And this is a very well-known picture that has been published quite a bit, and this picture was taken just right over here, right near where we're standing, and that's some of the workers standing next to the finished barrels of lime. All right, so they took about 4.5 to 5 days for a burn, and then they hauled the lime out through the little doorways and loaded it into the barrels, put the barrels on the wagons, hauled the wagons down Bay Street, and then loaded the lime barrels onto ships at the end of the street. In that photograph that we just saw, of the men standing next to the barrels. If you look very carefully at those barrels, they have wooden hoops on them. And the hoops in those days were made out of hazelnut. Hazelnut is a native shrub that grows in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Bob Pewarzik picked some samples for our tour today. And one of the interesting features of hazelnut is it's very, very bendable. And even more bendable when used for the barrels, because they would split each hazelnut wand in half, and then they'd use it to make the hoops, and then they'd nail the hoops around the staves to hold the barrel together. Later years they used metal hoops. If you look at the lime barrel that is on display in the History Gallery at the Museum of Art and History, that one has metal hoops. So it's a newer barrel. What they made here was called lumped lime.
So did they crush it before they put it in the barrels?
No, they left it in lumps, and the reason why is because lime, as soon as it comes out of the kiln, starts to spoil. It starts to absorb moisture out of the air, and it has to be kept as dry as possible. So by leaving it in large chunks, even though the outer edge might start to break down, the inner part was still good. But that brings up an important point about the lime and why they had 3 kilns. Lime has a rather short shelf life, so they didn't want to make too much of it at once. They waited till they got orders, and then they filled the orders. They couldn't, store it for months and months or years. So these kilns, by having 3 kilns here, they could have one, and they're really busy. They could have one that was being fired, they could be loading one, and they could be unloading one. So by having 3, they could be pretty much continuously producing the lime. But if sales dropped off, they could shut down one of the kilns or 2 of the kilns, and sometimes there was a slump, or during the winter when the weather was real bad, they shut them down completely and didn't make lime for several weeks or even months.
How was the demand for lime? What was the demand for lime? Was it in high demand? Were there lime kilns all over the state, or was this a monopoly?
Well, this area primarily supplied the San Francisco market early on, and also later. By the 1880s, lime was being shipped from Santa Cruz as far south as San Diego and as far north as Oregon. And some of it was even shipped by way of San Francisco to Hawaii. But there were other places in the state where lime was manufactured, especially over in the Sierra foothills around Auburn and Placerville, and some of those operations supplied lime for Gold Rush area towns in Sacramento and Stockton, although Cowell had a couple of big plants over there too, so he was in a lot of different places. The question is, did it become, when the lime is put in barrels, did it become flammable? Well, lime is not flammable, but lime, if you add water to it, it sort of reverses the chemical reaction that happened with the kilns. And you can sort of think of it as all that heat, the 1700 or 2000 degrees Fahrenheit of heat that was put in to make the stuff starts coming back out. So if a barrel of lime gets wet, it really heats up so much that it'll catch the wood of the barrel on fire. And this is why lime was a rather dangerous cargo for these ships to haul. And there are several stories of ships, springing a leak on their way to San Francisco, and this was not good. You had a lot of nervous sailors. In one case, they were even, they battened down the hatches to try to smother it, not let any air in, and all the deckhands, slept on this warm deck during the night so they could jump into the lifeboats at the last minute if they needed to. But usually they made it. If the captain knew what he was doing, he could resolve the problem somehow and not have the ship catch fire.
What size were those rocks they put in the barrels? Were they pebble size?
About like this. Yeah, he asked what size the rocks were that they put in their barrels, and the rocks usually started out about basketball size or soccer ball size, and like I say, they shrunk to about 80% of that size, so around that, but they're, you know, very irregular in shape. There's amazingly over at the Wilder Ranch, there is a kiln that is still loaded and was never fired, which I think is just amazing. And there you can see where inside the rocks are quite large, where they use them to build the arch, but near the top the rocks are quite small. But then, see, we did all this research, we had this all figured out, and then Mike Luther, one of our co-authors, he found some photographs up at UC Berkeley of some lime kilns up in Felton. It shows them liming the kiln, loading the kilns, and you can see great big rocks like this, you know, loaded right up to the top. So those kilns, though, were an unusual design, so maybe something about the design of the kilns made it.
Also, the source in the quarry might have geologically been a little different. So we find that even the amount of cordwood required to do a burn varies from site to site, because it's all done empirically, just by experience. So up in Felton, they might have had a different grade of ore. You have the fine crystals, you have the coarse crystals, you have pure white to grays, and depending on what you have at the source, the foreman or the superintendent might come up with a different scheme on how to get the best quality. Might add under quality is that the lime that was manufactured here was primarily all used in the building trades. It's known as construction lime. And of course, lime is used in a lot of other things, agriculturally and chemically. You use it to bleach the straw that was used in the paper mill up the San Lorenzo Valley. And you wouldn't pay top dollar for construction lime to make paper or paint out of, or to put on the ground in your field. So there's a clarification on
yeah, there were different grades of lime, but the rock here was so pure that a lot of the lime produced here was, you know, I don't know exactly what they call it, but it's basically, you know, number 1A, grade A lime. The best quality lime was used for interior plastering. Well, our final stop here, this is the what's called a continuous kiln, also known as a patent kiln or vertical kiln or shaft kiln. And this kiln was built in 1861 and is probably the most interesting and most complex kiln in Santa Cruz area. These other kilns here are what are called pot kilns. They're basically a big round pot inside. This one was designed to operate continuously, and so you didn't have to fire it all up and then shut it all down again to unload it. And the university was very kind. About a year ago, they let me climb inside it and take measurements. And this is a drawing of the shape of the shaft on the inside. And what they did is they dumped the rock in the top, and then they took they built a fire in the fire chamber on each side, which cooked it, turned it into lime. And then when they withdrew the finished lime out the bottom, the material, all the rock and lime, would shift down through the inside of the kiln, creating more space at the top again. So it just kept going, and this kiln could operate for weeks or months continuously.
Are we looking at the firing chamber or the withdrawal chamber?
That's the cooling chamber.
Wow.
And the little tiny door down there, it looks very small, but that's where the lime was removed. This is called like the storage zone up near the top of the shaft, and then a preheating area where the heat from the fire started to heat up the rock in preparation for turning it into the lime. And then the dissociation chamber, which is a fancy word meaning that's where they drove the carbon dioxide out of the rock and turned it into lime. And then down below the fire boxes is the cooling chamber where they let the lime cool down just enough so they could get it out and put it into the barrels without catching the barrels on fire. Ah, you noticed. You see this picture? I drew it a lot taller. And yeah, the question is, was it as tall as this originally? And yes, it was somewhat taller than it is now. The upper part of this kiln has been removed at some point, and we don't know just when.
Did it have any type of mover system inside to kind of strain it through, or was it just pretty much drop shaft?
It's just a straight shaft. This picture, this 1866 picture, this is a good one to look at again because this shows how they got the lime to the top of the kiln. See, there was a huge trestle, but way over here, which was gone by the early 1900s because they weren't using this kiln anymore, or not as much. All right, well, thank you very much for coming on our lime kiln tour here at the entrance to the UCSC campus. I hope you enjoyed everything, and if you get a chance to look at our book, Lime Kiln Legacies, which is at the Museum of Art and History and in local bookstores. So thank you very much.